Before diving into the tale, I think a bit of background is necessary. I have a thing for firearms, survival strategies, tactical gear, binoculars, flashlights, and the like. I own quite a collection of these items, and the crown jewel among them is a Remington 700 rifle, which you can legally purchase in the US after going through the required background checks and procedures. Along with this rifle, I've got a couple of high-quality scopes, one more powerful than the other. It's not that I'm some sort of maniac, but let's just say I like to feel prepared for any trouble in these unpredictable times. That's the prelude to my story. The actual story begins when I found myself renting an apartment in the Northeast District of a large American city for work-related reasons. It was a short-term arrangement just for a couple of months, so I didn't bother with many amenities. The apartment was on the top floor of a 12-story building. The view would have been spectacular if not for another 12-story building standing about 200 meters away, dominating the view from my windows. My place was pretty basic, lacking even a TV, and I didn't get internet service since I wasn't planning to stay long. My evenings, therefore, were pretty dull. Less work than anticipated left me with too much free time, spent reading until dusk, when I'd start playing what I called the watching game with my rifle. This pastime I concocted about 3 days into my stay. I'd set up the rifle's scope to watch the streets, guessing the distance to various objects and occasionally peeking into some windows. It became somewhat of an obsession. I dragged my writing desk to the window, set up my Remington with its scope, and through a slit in the drawn curtains, began to study the inhabitants of the building across. I spent nearly every evening this way. You might judge me, and I wouldn't argue. There's something unsettling about observing people through the crosshairs of a scope, even if the gun is unloaded. But once I started, I couldn't stop. That building was a hive of intriguing characters. While the guy on the 6th floor who watched adult films every night quickly bored me, the kid on the 9th floor practicing karate in his kitchen, and a passionate young couple on the 7th floor became my favorites. This couple was particularly interesting. In the few days I watched, they were quite uninhibited, seemingly unaware of how to turn off their bedroom lights. Their endless energy was captivating. I fancied I could learn something from them. There were others too, alcoholics amusing only during their drunken brawls, single mothers with kids, fairly normal families, quite a mix. But this story isn't about them. One evening, my casual surveillance led me to a window on the 8th floor I hadn't paid much attention to before. Inside was a nearly empty room, lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its door shut tight. A bed occupied one corner, on which sat a person in the lotus position. This figure caught my eye because of their utter stillness. They sat with their back to the window, facing the wall, extremely thin, pale, and tall, with a disproportionately large, completely bald head. They wore no shirt or pants. After about 5 minutes of observation, they hadn't moved an inch. I scanned the room, a couple of chairs, a coffee table cluttered with newspapers, an old armchair, a small rug by the bed, and the door with some strange vertical marks on it. Nothing else. Assuming the person was simply meditating, I moved on to my favorite Karate Kid for entertainment. 2 hours later, after both the young martial artist and the indefatigable couple had called it a night, I checked back on the meditator. They remained in the same position, facing the wall. After a half-minute wait, I put the rifle away and went to bed, half expecting to forget the whole thing. But I didn't forget. A couple of days later, I accidentally peeked into the meditator's window again. Nothing had changed, which irrationally annoyed me. I had somehow come to believe every tenant owed me some form of evening entertainment. Yet this individual just sat there, staring at a wall, or perhaps sleeping sitting up. Or maybe they weren't alive at all. Could it be a mannequin? Or had they simply reached some profound meditative state and phased out into the astral plane? Curiosity gripped me. For an hour, I watched without seeing them move an inch. Definitely a mannequin, I concluded, especially considering their unnatural thinness and oversized head. But what was a mannequin doing alone in a room? Was this room some kind of prop storage? Why was no one else entering? Was the apartment abandoned? And who turned on the light? I examined the neighboring windows. To the right, judging by the layout, definitely another apartment where a family with 2 young children lived. To the left, the windows were dark, unlit. Puzzled, I tried to distract myself, but neither the Karate Kid nor the naturalists could lift my spirits that evening. The next day, I came home from work early and immediately glued myself to the scope. The figure was still there, in the same position, though it seemed slightly turned. Something was happening, however minute. I watched the entire evening, foregoing even bathroom breaks. There they sat, facing the wall, barely breathing, if at all. My eyes ached, and eventually I went to bed frustrated. The routine continued for a week. A couple of minutes in the morning and several hours in the evening I'd observe, noticing tiny changes in their position, but never catching the moment of movement. One day, I returned from work to find their bed linens changed, a development that finally pushed me to initiate round-the-clock surveillance. I spent the evening setting up a system that satisfied me. My rifle on a tripod aimed at the window, with a video camera lens attached to the rifle's scope, recording directly to my laptop's hard drive. I could now monitor what happened during the hours I was at work. After a final check in the morning, I hit record and left for the day. My initial attempt was a letdown. The camera captured everything faithfully, but the figure remained motionless on the bed for the entire 8 hours of footage. It took a lot of patience to set everything up again for another day. Luck was on my side the next attempt. Reviewing the footage, I saw at 14:17 the door to the room open, and a woman entered with a tray in her hands. At first I thought she was there to feed them, but the tray held only a small bottle and a few boxes. She approached slowly, placed the tray on the bed, and stood beside it, looking at the figure. I expected them to converse, but her lips didn't move. Then, she began massaging their left arm before leaning in, seemingly giving an injection. Her actions were obscured by the figure's thin back, but it appeared she administered a shot. Oddly, she then sidled up to the window, cracked it open, and smoked a cigarette. After finishing, she closed the window, collected the tray, and backed out of the room, closing the door behind her. The rest of the footage showed no activity. Had I not had the camera, I'd have remained oblivious to her visit. I watched the video several times, feeling an unsettling strangeness about it. On the surface, everything seemed straightforward. A pallid, emaciated figure, possibly with some condition, tended to by a caregiver who made an injection, smoked, and left. But something was off. I couldn't pinpoint what exactly, but it nagged at me. I checked on my charge through the scope, still sitting the bastard, and went to bed, troubled. Over the next week, using my makeshift surveillance setup, I learned that A, the woman with the tray visited every 2 days around 3 p.m., gave an injection, smoked, and left. B, nothing else of note happened in the room. Still, the situation consumed me. I hadn't seen how they changed the bed linens, and I realized what was so odd about the woman's behavior. In the 3 times I'd seen her enter the room, she never once turned her back to the figure. I neglected work, observing for several weeks. The linens were changed again, but I missed it. It must have happened at night. I also discovered that the woman left the apartment a few times a week for about 30-40 minutes. I saw her leave the building and return with shopping bags. I followed her a few times. She'd go to a nearby grocery store and then stop by a pharmacy. Curious about her pharmacy purchases, I hesitated to inquire directly, leaving her transactions a mystery. The woman's routine continued. Enter the room every 2 days, inject, smoke, and leave, never turning her back to the figure. I scrutinized every detail of the room, pondering over the marks on the door and the peeling wallpaper. The marks, scratches in the paint, and the peeled wallpaper seemed to be the work of their long nails. There was no concrete reason to believe this, but no other explanation made sense. The figure began to terrify me. Watching them through the scope, hours on end, while knowing that just a wall away, children played unknowingly close to this grotesque presence. I knew I had to act, but was at a loss. Call the police? And say what? They'd arrive, receive no answer at the door, and then what? I was beside myself. After scouring the internet for anything remotely similar to my situation and coming up empty, save for one story that seemed relevant, I tried to gather information from the building's residents to no avail. Finally, I made the most idiotic decision of my life. I prepared meticulously, arming myself with my best knives, a pepper spray gun for self-defense, a mask for anonymity, lockpicks, a flashlight, distraction fireworks, and a smoke grenade. I distributed these items across my pockets, aiming not to look suspicious or make noise with every step. Then I sat on a bench outside the building, waiting. If law enforcement had approached me then, I'd have been in a world of trouble. Part of me wishes that had happened. Sitting there, I realized I had no plan. About 40 minutes later, the woman left the apartment building, heading towards the store as usual. I had at least half an hour. I entered the building and climbed to the 8th floor. The door to the hallway was unlocked, and I stepped inside, finding myself in a dimly lit corridor cluttered at one end. Along the walls were bed frames, a wheelless bicycle, skis, a sled, dusty boxes, fragments of wooden furniture, and a wheelchair that oddly caught my attention. I moved towards the cluttered end, where the door to the apartment I was interested in was located. Apartment 41's door was unremarkable, but as I stood a few meters away, gathering my thoughts, I questioned my presence there. Trembling, I couldn't move forward or formulate a plan, my gaze shifting between the door and the wheelchair. Suddenly, I heard something else besides my heavy breathing. A shuffling sound from behind apartment 41's door, growing closer. Before I could process the sound, it ceased, and an eerie silence followed. The realization that it was the figure's shuffling steps dawned on me slowly. They had approached the door and were now likely staring out the peephole. As I processed this, the doorknob rattled violently, and something heavy slammed against the door from the inside, causing it to creak ominously. Panic took over, and I ran, not remembering how I descended 8 flights so quickly. Only when I emerged from the building did I regain some composure, making a detour to avoid leading anyone directly to my apartment. I reached my room in 10 minutes, without taking off my shoes, grabbed the rifle, and aimed at the figure's window. What I saw then terrified me beyond words. They were standing at the window, scraping at the glass with their hands, staring directly at me. In that brief glimpse, I saw a skeletal figure with skin stretched tight over protruding bones, long claw-like fingers scratching the glass, and a large, pale, hairless head with a grotesque, noseless face, 2 dark eyes, and a lipless mouth leaving moist trails on the window, fixated on me. I felt their gaze. Even as fear paralyzed my mind, my body knew to act. I stumbled away from the window, grabbing a box of ammunition. In seconds, I was back, rifle loaded, not caring about the consequences. I racked the bolt and aimed, but when I looked again, only the fluttering curtains remained. I left the apartment that day, settling accounts with the landlord, grateful for his lack of questions. Throwing myself into work, I tried to forget, but occasionally the memory surfaces. I understood why they faced the wall. It was deliberate, to keep them from seeing others. Who were they? I don't know. Dangerous? Undoubtedly. Sometimes they appear in my dreams, scratching at my door while I peer through the peephole, my rifle misfiring every time. I dislike that they saw me. Am I afraid? I have weapons and know how to defend myself, but it would be a lie to say I'm not scared.